Let's move to today's topic, which is a topic that I've been interested in and working on for most of my career. The question about how ought we to treat non-human animals. It's something that I'd really never thought about until I was a graduate student, because at that time it wasn't an issue that people talked about. It was simply not a prominent question when people thought about moral issues. They thought about a lot of the other issues that we think about now, like racism and abortion, and we thought a lot about war and peace, of course, during the Vietnam War era, and about the dangers of nuclear war and whether it was ethical for a country even to possess nuclear weapons which were lined up and ready to be fired at population centres of other countries. But somehow animals didn't really get onto the moral radar. It was perhaps something we just all thought was less important than any issues relating to humans. We didn't like to see people being cruel to animals. That was considered bad, but it wasn't really an issue that was being discussed as a major moral issue. And that's an enormous change in where we are today, and I think that's clearly a change for the better. But it's important to realise how far that we've come from views that were widely held until quite recently. So let's start by looking backwards at where we've come from in terms of the views that have been expressed on this issue over the last, say, 2.5 millennia. So we start with a view from the Hebrew tradition, which of course came over into Christianity because of the use of the Hebrew scriptures. So this is a famous verse from Genesis. The whole description of creation is of course human-centered. God creates the world, and then he creates various other things, and he creates the animals on it. And then finally, the culmination of creation is that he makes man. He makes man in his own image. He's not described as making the non-human animals in his own image. And then he gives them dominion over everything, over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So the way in which this was understood until quite recently was simply that God has handed over everything else to humans to do as they like with. That at least was the dominant view. So it means that we have responsibility for what we do, but the idea of dominion was standardly interpreted as one of mastery, of being able to do as we wished with them and use them in our own interests. When I say standardly, I'll give you an example in a few moments, but not perhaps quite universally, but that was certainly the very common view. And it's only much more recently that some Christian thinkers have, and I suppose Jewish thinkers too, but I'm thinking particularly of some Christian writers who've reinterpreted this and said that the text should not be taken as understood as dominion in that sense of the term. It should rather be the idea that God has given us creation as a kind of stewardship. Yes, we look after it, but we are answerable to him for the way we treat it. And we ought to treat it well, otherwise we'll be a bad steward, as if you handed over your possessions, or a steward was somebody, for example, whom if you owned a large estate and you wanted to travel away, you would leave it to your steward to look after it. And that didn't mean, of course, that your steward could do whatever he liked with it, and when you came back and found it ruined, he would say, well, you gave it over to me. On the contrary, the steward's responsibility was to look after it well and keep it in good shape. So that's one of the roots of Western civilization that comes out of the Hebrew tradition. Another important one is one that comes from the Greek tradition. And in ancient Greek philosophy, there were different views about this question of how we ought to treat animals and the moral status of animals. There was, for example, a tradition kept by the school of philosophy led by Pythagoras. Now, we don't actually know a lot about the thought of Pythagoras. You've all heard of Pythagoras' theorem, and that's what mostly people think of when we think of Pythagoras today. But Pythagoras led a school of philosophy, and though none of his writings have survived, there are accounts of this school by others, and it seems clear that the school was vegetarian. We don't entirely know why. We don't know whether this was because of ethical concerns for animals or whether it was because of some belief in reincarnation. There's some suggestions that Pythagoras was influenced by Hindu traditions. But there is a later Pythagorean, somebody like the school called Porphyry, who does write about animals and suggests that we ought not to be cruel to them. So it's possible that the Pythagorean tradition did not accept this kind of view, which is here in a quote from Aristotle. But in terms of influence on the West, Aristotle, probably even more than Plato, has been the dominant influence in the West because of his acceptance into Christian traditions. So Aristotle thought that the world is a hierarchy, or a teleology, really, that it exists for a purpose. This is, of course, a pre-evolutionary view of of the universe, and the less rational exists for the sake of the more rational. So plants exist for the sake of animals, and the brute beasts, who are less rational than humans, exist for the sake of humans, and they provide us with food and with fur or leather for skins, for leather. And again, Aristotle also thought we don't really have duties to them. Aristotle also thought that some humans are less rational than others. In particular, as a Greek, he thought that the non-Greeks, the barbarians, are less rational than the Greeks, and therefore believed that slavery was justified. The slavery of barbarians, not of Greeks, was justified on these terms. So the hierarchy extends right through, and of course, we have all rejected for some time Aristotle's views about slavery, but not so clearly his views about the role of animals. Well, the two traditions that I've mentioned, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Greek tradition, come together in medieval Europe because medieval Europe rediscovered the Greeks, and it was particularly Aristotle that they rediscovered. Aristotle had survived through Arabic translations of it, through the cultural high points of Arabic culture in that period or before that period. And so Aristotle became known in Europe in the Middle Ages, and the great incorporator of Aristotle into the Christian tradition was Thomas Aquinas. And for Aquinas, Aristotle fitted very well into that tradition, partly because of this hierarchical view of nature in which human beings are at the pinnacle. So Aquinas says in his great work, the Summa Theologica, he says, it matters not how man behaves to animals because God has subjected all things to man's power. This is a reference back clearly to the Dominion verse, but he also refers to Aristotle. He refers to him simply as the philosopher. He's really the only philosopher who was well known or highly regarded in that period, and he refers to Aristotle as backing up this view. And notice the language here. It matters not how man behaves to animals. This is the harsh interpretation of the Dominion thesis. But wasn't just Aristotle, it wasn't just Aquinas' idea to interpret it in this way. He could appeal back to Augustine, one of the great church fathers, who had the same idea. Augustine considers the question, why is it that in the New Testament Jesus takes the Gadarene swine, which have been possessed by devils, you might remember, and causes them to drown themselves in the sea? Why did he do that? That seems both cruel to the pigs, that they then drowned themselves. It wasn't their fault after all that they'd been possessed by devils, and also presumably harmful to the person whose property they were. So Augustine's explanation of this is that Jesus was demonstrating to us that we have no duties to animals, that we only have duties to other human beings. And Aquinas here is very much in that tradition, and he says other things that make it really clear that when he says it matters not, he really means that it doesn't matter what we do to animals as far as the animals are concerned. He says, he has another section in which he talks about the kinds of sins we can have. We can have sins to our neighbours, and we can have sins towards God, and we can have sins towards ourselves, but we can't have sins to animals because they are not our neighbours, because they don't have immortal souls, they don't partake in that fellowship of immortal souls, and therefore it doesn't. We don't have the possibility of sinning towards animals. So this is a really harsh view. The only little caveat on this is that, of course, Aquinas is concerned that we should not be cruel to each other, to humans. And he does express at one point a reason that we might not be cruel to animals because it might lead us to develop a cruel disposition, might lead us to be cruel to humans. But the implication is, again, that the cruelty to the animals, in fact we're inflicting suffering on the animals, doesn't matter at all. It's only if it's going to lead to suffering to humans that it will matter.